The scent of olive oil lamps mingles with sea salt on the night air. Beyond the palace walls, waves whisper against the shores of the Thermaic Gulf. Inside, in chambers hung with Tyrian purple, a woman labors in childbirth while priests murmur incantations older than memory. The year is 356 before our common reckoning, and the world is about to shift on its axis, though no one yet knows it. In the rugged northern kingdom of Macedonia, where Greek refinement bleeds into something wilder, more ancient, a child draws his first breath. That same night, far to the south across dark waters, flames consumed the temple of Artemis at Ephesus. The palace at Pella smells of wood smoke and wine, of horses and iron being worked in forges beyond the courtyard. This is a place where marble statues stand beside rough-hewn timber, where philosophers debate in halls adorned with frescoes showing both heroic Greeks and mounted warriors in strange foreign dress. The Macedonians occupy a liminal space, neither fully Greek nor quite barbarian, dwelling where civilization frays at its edges. Their vowels fall differently than the pure Attic spoken in Athens. Their customs carry the weight of older, darker practices. Yet their kings trace golden threads of ancestry back through time, claiming Heracles himself as forefather and through the mother's line, descent from Achilles of the swift feet, that brilliant doomed hero who chose glory over long life. The wooden columns, cedar from Lebanon, crack and groan as fire climbs toward the star-strewn sky. One of the 7 wonders of the world burns to ash while the goddess herself, so the storytellers will later whisper, attends a more important birth. Truth or legend, who can say? Time smooths all sharp edges into story. Philip, the father, is a force of nature trapped in human form. In his youth he knew the inside of a prison cell in Thebes, held hostage to guarantee his kingdom's good behavior. But what the Thebans meant as humiliation became education. He watched their sacred band drill, 300 pairs of lovers who swore to die rather than flee while their beloved still lived. He studied the tactics that made Theban armies feared throughout Greece. When fate and family intrigue finally brought him home to claim Macedonia's throne, he carried those lessons like seeds waiting for fertile soil. The army he inherited was little more than tribal levies, brave enough but undisciplined, armed with whatever weapons their families could afford. Philip transformed them into something new under the sun. The sarissa, a pike so long a man could barely carry it alone, became their signature. 18 feet of cornel wood tipped with iron, held in both hands, creating a forest of spear points that no cavalry could penetrate, no infantry could break. The boy growing in these halls will hear these stories before he can properly walk, will fall asleep to tales of demigods and monsters, of labors accomplished and fates fulfilled. Into this atmosphere of controlled violence and burning ambition comes Alexander, first of sons, heir to everything. His mother Olympias arrives from Epirus, trailing mystery like incense smoke. She keeps serpents sacred to ancient goddesses. She dances in midnight rituals on the mountains, possessed by divine madness, her hair unbound, her voice raised in wordless ecstasy. The ancient chroniclers, writing generations later with styluses scratching on papyrus, paint her as passionate to the point of danger, jealous, fierce, a mother who will destroy anything threatening her son's destiny. The marriage between Philip and Olympias crackles with tension, electric as summer storms gathering over the mountains. importance. They are both too strong, too certain, too unwilling to bend. Hour after hour they drilled in the fields outside Pella, moving as one body, their individual wills subsumed into the greater organism of the phalanx. The ground trembled under their unified step. The air sang with their synchronized breath. Stories cluster around Alexander's childhood like bees around honeycomb, sweetened by time, impossible to separate truth from embellishment. The tale of Bucephalus has been told 10,000 times, but still it gleams. Picture it. A horse is brought before King Philip, black as midnight, tall and powerful, wild-eyed and dangerous. The merchants who brought him want an enormous sum, claiming he is descended from the legendary horses of Diomedes. But the animal is too fierce, too unpredictable. He rears and strikes with iron-shod hoofs. Grooms scatter. Philip waves the merchants away, unwilling to pay for an animal no one can ride. But his son, barely into adolescence, lean and sun-browned from hours in the gymnasium, steps forward. The boy has been watching, really watching, in a way that will characterize his whole life. He sees what others miss. The horse shies from his own shadow, confused and frightened by the dark shape that follows wherever he turns. Alexander asks his father's permission to try, and Philip, perhaps amused by the presumption, perhaps curious about what his strange, intense son will do, agrees. The boy approaches slowly, speaking in a low, steady voice, words too soft for the watching crowd to hear. He takes the bridle gently, no sudden movements, no aggression, and turns the horse to face the sun. The shadow falls away behind, invisible now, no longer a pursuing monster. The horse's ears flick forward. His breathing steadies. Alexander keeps talking, that low, hypnotic murmur. And then in one fluid motion born of hours practicing in the cavalry drills, he is up, seated, his thighs gripping the barrel of the horse's ribs. They stand still for a heartbeat, boy and beast, and then Alexander gives the slightest pressure with his knees, and they are moving, first walking, then trotting, then suddenly bursting into a gallop, circling the field while the watching men cheer or gasp. When Alexander returns and slides down from Bucephalus's back, Philip embraces him with tears bright in his eyes, saying that Macedonia is too small for such a son, that he must seek a kingdom worthy of his abilities. Whether Philip actually spoke those words, or whether they are the invention of court historians polishing the tale, they capture something essential. His education begins with athletes and warriors teaching him to ride, to fight with sword and spear, to wrestle in the Greek fashion, naked bodies gleaming with olive oil under the Macedonian sun. But Philip wants more for his heir than military excellence. When Alexander reaches 13, the king sends invitations to the greatest minds in the Greek world, and Aristotle himself, pupil of Plato, teacher of future generations, accepts the commission. The philosopher establishes his school in the sanctuary of the nymphs at Mysa, a grove where clear water flows over smooth stones and dappled light falls through oak leaves. Here, away from the political intrigue of Pella, away from the clang of the forges and the shouts of drilling soldiers, Alexander and the sons of Macedonian nobility gather to learn. They study the golden verses of Homer until they can recite whole books from memory. They dissect the arguments of rhetoric, learning to sway assemblies with carefully constructed speeches. The child who grows between these two poles of parental intensity absorbs something of each, his father's calculating brilliance and his mother's absolute conviction of divine favor. From the beginning, Everyone sensed this child was marked for something extraordinary. Of all the texts they study, the Iliad burns brightest in Alexander's imagination. The story of Achilles, his ancestor, that brilliant, violent man who knew from birth he was marked for early death and chose to embrace it, to live furiously in the time given rather than settling for safe obscurity. Alexander will carry a copy of Homer everywhere he goes, keeping it under his pillow alongside a dagger, the twin tools of civilization and survival. Years later, standing beside what may or may not be the actual tomb of Achilles at Troy, he will run naked around the monument as custom demands, garlanding it with flowers, declaring himself blessed to have such an ancestor, blessed to have found a Homer to immortalize him as Achilles had been immortalized. The relationship between student and teacher is complex and will grow more complicated with time. Aristotle teaches that Greek culture represents the pinnacle of human achievement, that barbarians are naturally suited to slavery, that the rational Hellenic mind should rule over the passionate Oriental temperament. They examine plants and animals, learning to categorize the natural world, seeking the underlying order beneath apparent chaos. Aristotle opens their minds to the idea that knowledge is unified, that understanding politics and understanding biology are part of one great project of comprehending reality itself. He does not study alone. Philip has gathered the sons of his companions and nobles, creating bonds between Alexander and the boys who will one day lead his armies, govern his provinces, shape his legacy. They compete endlessly in the gymnasium and in the classroom, wrestling matches and philosophical debates, learning to trust each other and learning where each excels. Hephaestion, who even in youth is tall and beautiful, becomes closest of all. Their bond goes deeper than friendship, though the exact nature of it is something the ancient sources handled delicately. Speaking in the language of heroes and their companions, Achilles and Patroclus, Heracles and Iolaus, leaving unstated what need not be said. Ptolemy is there too, who will rule Egypt after Alexander's death and commission the histories that shape the story for all later generations. Alexander absorbs these lessons, but will eventually complicate them in ways his teacher never intended. Will marry Persian women and adopt Persian dress and attempt to blend rather than dominate. Will die trying to fuse East and West into something new. The physical training never ceases. Macedonian nobility proves itself in blood and sweat. The mountains around Pella are dangerous, populated by boar with tusks that can disembowel a man, lions whose roars echo down the valleys at dusk, bears massive and unpredictable. To hunt these creatures with only spear and shield, to feel the ground shake as a boar charges, to see the moment its tiny vicious eyes fix on you and know it has committed to the attack, to plant your spear and hold against the impact. This is the testing that transforms boys into warriors. Alexander excels at this, as he seems to excel at everything, though his excellence comes not from size, but from intensity. He is small, compact, built like a wrestler rather than the towering hero later artists will imagine. His endurance is legendary, even among the tough Macedonians. He can march all day and debate philosophy all night. Cassander and Craterus and Perdiccas and Nearchus, names that will echo through the halls of power, all growing up together in Misa's green sanctuary, bound by shared experience and the charisma of their prince, who even then seems marked by something divine or perhaps just absolutely convinced of his own destiny. As Alexander grows from boy to young man, Philip's ambitions devour Greece. The southern cities watch with growing alarm as the Macedonian king's influence spreads like oil across water, impossible to contain. Through a combination of military victories and shrewd diplomacy, through well-placed bribes and timely displays of overwhelming force, Philip brings city after city into his orbit. Athens, proud Athens of the silver-tongued orators and magnificent temples, fumes but cannot quite bring itself to act decisively. Thebes, stubborn militaristic Thebes, prepares for war. Dozens of smaller city-states calculate odds and pick sides, or try to remain neutral. The balance of power that has governed Greek politics for generations is collapsing. Philip has changed the rules of the game, professionalizing warfare in a way that renders the old citizen-soldier model obsolete. His ultimate goal shimmers on the eastern horizon, visible to anyone who thinks strategically. His voice is harsh, perhaps from shouting orders across battlefields, or perhaps simply the voice he was born with. His eyes are peculiar, one dark and one light, according to some sources, heterochromia that makes him memorable, makes people uncomfortable meeting his gaze, as if his mixed eyes reflect a mixed nature, part human and part something else. When Alexander reaches 16, Philip judges him ready to bear real responsibility. The king must campaign in the north against troublesome tribes, and he leaves his teenage son as regent in Macedonia, entrusting him with the royal seal, the authority to issue commands in the king's name. It is an extraordinary show of confidence, and Alexander seizes it with both hands. The Mede, a Thracian tribe that has paid tribute to Macedonia for years, see Philip's absence as opportunity and rise in rebellion. A more cautious regent might send messengers to recall the king. Alexander instead gathers troops, assesses the situation with a quick, analytical mind Aristotle trained, and marches. The campaign is brief and decisive. The Mede are crushed. On the site of their principal town, Alexander found a new city and names it Alexandropolis, his first city bearing his name, established at age 16. The message could not be clearer. The heir is not ceremonial. He is capable, ambitious, ready to lead. He will unite the Greeks under Macedonian leadership and launch a war of revenge and conquest against Persia, that vast empire that invaded Greece generations before under Xerxes, that still looms as threat and temptation with its legendary wealth, its endless territories, its cities of wonder and strangeness. 2 years later, the great confrontation comes, at Chaeronea, in the summer heat when dust devils dance across the plain. Philip's army meets the combined forces of Athens and Thebes. This is the battle that will decide Greece's future. Philip commands the right wing and the center where the phalanx stands bristling with sarissas. To Alexander, 18 years old, he gives command of the left wing, the companion cavalry. The elite shock troops will deliver the decisive blow. The enemy forces are brave and well-trained. The Theban sacred band holds the place of honor. 300 men in 150 pairs, lovers who have sworn never to retreat while their partner lives, who would rather die together than live separated by the shame of cowardice. When Philip returns and hears what his son has accomplished, does he feel pride or perhaps a touch of unease? The boy is surpassing him young. And Philip is worldly enough to know that fathers and sons in royal houses often end as rivals. But Philip's tactics and training prove superior. The battle flows and shifts like water, finding channels. The phalanx grinds forward, an inexorable pressure that forces the enemy to adjust to shift to create tiny gaps in their line. Philip may even intentionally order a tactical retreat on his wing, drawing the enemy forward, making them stretch their formation. And then Alexander sees the moment he has been waiting for, the opening created by enemy success, the gap between units. He does not wait for orders. He leads the companion cavalry forward at a gallop, wedge formation, heavy horses and armored men driving like a spear point into the vulnerable joint of the enemy line. The impact is catastrophic. Men and horses collide with the sickening crunch of breaking bones and tearing flesh. The Macedonians push through, widening the breach, getting into the rear of the enemy formation where chaos multiplies. The Athenian line begins to crumble, but the sacred band does not retreat. They reform in a circle around the breach, shields locked, spears leveled, fighting with desperate courage. Alexander's cavalry hammers at them again and again. Gradually the circle shrinks, tightens, as men fall wounded or dying, but none break and run. When the battle finally ends, all 300 lie dead, their formation unbroken even in death, a circle of corpses that marks where they made their stand. The Athenians remember their city's glory days, when they broke the Persian invasion at Marathon and Salamis, when they led the Delian League, when their silver mines and merchant fleet made them wealthy beyond measure. They fight to restore that glory, to push back the Macedonian threat. Philip's victory at Corinthia makes him master Greece. The city-states have no choice now but to acknowledge Macedonian dominance. Philip establishes the League of Corinth, binding the Greek cities in an alliance under his leadership, and declares its purpose, war against Persia. Alexander, surveying the carnage afterwards, is reported to have wept at the sight, moved by such courage even in his enemies. It is not the last time his capacity for sudden emotion will surprise observers. The fracture comes at a wedding feast, that most dangerous of occasions where wine flows freely and old resentments surface. Philip has married again, taking a young Macedonian woman named Cleopatra, niece of one of his generals, Attalus. This is politically charged because Cleopatra is fully Macedonian, while Olympias is foreign, from Epirus, and therefore Alexander's claim to the throne could be questioned. At the wedding celebration, Attalus rises with a wine cup in his hand, his face flushed from drinking, and proposes a toast. He prays to the gods that this marriage will produce a legitimate heir to the Macedonian throne. The implication detonates like lightning striking the hall. Alexander, sitting at the high table with his mother's foreign blood flowing through his veins, his legitimacy suddenly questioned in public, reacts with volcanic fury. He seizes his own cup and hurls it at Attalus, his voice cutting through the sudden silence to ask if Attalus dares call him a bastard. Philip, also drunk, struggles to his feet and draws his sword, lurching toward his own son. But the king's war-damaged leg betrays him, and he stumbles and falls heavily to the floor. Alexander stands over his fallen father and speaks with withering contempt, remarking that here lies the man who plans to cross from Europe to Asia, but cannot manage to cross from one couch to another. The great campaign will finally happen. The revenge for Xerxes' invasion generations ago, the conquest of the wealthy East. Philip sends advance forces across the Hellespont to secure a foothold in Asia Minor. Everything is falling into place, but the domestic situation is deteriorating, poisoned by jealousy and ambition and the complexities of polygamous royal marriages. Alexander takes Olympias and leaves Macedonia, going into exile in Epirus. It cannot last. Alexander is too obviously the heir, proven in battle, popular with the army, trained from birth for command. Philip cannot afford to alienate him permanently, not with the Persian invasion looming. Through intermediaries, through careful diplomacy, through compromises that salve everyone's pride, if not their feelings, the breach is mended. Alexander returns to court, but something is broken that cannot be fully repaired. Trust is cracked. The easy relationship between father and son, commander and subordinate, king and heir, has become complicated and careful. Then, in the year 336 before our Common Era, at another wedding, this one for Alexander's sister, tragedy strikes, or fate unfolds, or conspiracy succeeds, depending on which theory you favor. Philip enters the theater where the celebrations will occur, walking ahead of his bodyguards in a show of confidence, and a young man named Pausanias approaches and drives a knife into the king's chest. Philip falls, blood spreading dark across his ceremonial robes, his breath coming in ragged gasps that quickly weaken and stop. Who was behind it? Pausanias had a personal grievance against Philip. That much seems clear from the sources. Something about being raped or insulted by someone in the king's circle and Philip refusing to punish the offender adequately. Personal revenge is plausible, but suspicion falls on others too. Olympias had motive, her position and her son's position threatened by Philip's new marriage. Alexander himself had most to gain, ascending to power immediately rather than waiting years or decades for his father to die naturally. Persian gold might have bought the assassination, preventing the invasion before it could truly begin. The truth dies with Pausanias on the theater floor. Then he turns and walks out, the silence behind him thicker than walls. The palace atmosphere grows heavy with faction and suspicion. Pausanias tries to flee, but is brought down and killed, silenced forever before he can name any accomplices if he had them. The murder weapon falls to the dusty ground, and Macedonia suddenly lacks a king. Alexander's position is immediately precarious, balanced on a knife's edge above an abyss. He is young, untested as a ruler, surrounded by potential rivals and actual enemies. Within the royal family, other men have theoretical claims to the throne, and in Macedonian politics, theory can quickly become reality if backed by enough swords. What survives is the fact that Philip, who united Greece and built the army and planned the great conquest, dies on the cusp of his greatest triumph, and his 20-year-old son inherits everything, all the power and all the danger. The Greek cities, never happy under Macedonian dominance, see the transition of power as opportunity. Rumors spread that Alexander is young and untested, that he lacks his father's genius, that this is the moment to throw off the Macedonian yoke. Thebes begins gathering forces. Athènes débat des interventions. To the north, the tribal peoples Philip had subdued through years of campaigning test the new king's resolve with raids and provocations. Alexander faces threats from every direction and has to prove himself immediately or watch his father's entire legacy crumble. Alexander acts with decisive brutality, eliminating potential rivals so swiftly that the full extent is hard to track in the sources. It is ruthless, but probably necessary by the savage mathematics of ancient monarchy. Fail to act decisively, and you will almost certainly be killed by someone who does act decisively. Better to be the killer than the killed. First comes a rapid campaign in the north. Marching the army with punishing speed through rough terrain, fighting skirmishes and battles against the Triballi and other tribes, demonstrating that the new king is at least as dangerous as his father was. The Macedonian army, that professional instrument Philip forged, functions perfectly under Alexander's command, which reassures the soldiers and terrifies his enemies. Then he forces the Danube crossing, the great river that marks the edge of the known world, to Greeks, driving barbarian forces back and establishing his reputation for audacity. Rumors reach Thebes that Alexander has been killed in the northern campaign. The reports are specific enough to be believed, detailed enough to be convincing. The Thebans, encouraged by these reports and by Athenian promises of support and probably Persian gold, rise in rebellion and lay siege to the Macedonian garrison holding their citadel. It is a direct challenge to Macedonian power and to Alexander's authority. The new king receives word while still in the north, and his response is characteristically swift and shocking. He marches the army south, covering the distance so quickly that it seems impossible, and appears before Thebes days before any reasonable person expected him. His response reveals the character that will define his reign. Bold, swift, utterly uncompromising, willing to embrace extremes that more cautious leaders would avoid. But while he campaigns in the north, more trouble brews in Greece. He offers them a chance to surrender, to back down, to blame everything on a few ringleaders and avoid catastrophe. The Thebans refuse, perhaps expecting Athenian help, perhaps simply too proud to submit. What follows is a lesson written in blood and ashes, a message that will echo through Greece for generations. Alexander's forces storm the city. The fighting is savage, house to house, street to street, the Macedonians and their Greek allies taking revenge for the rebellion. In the battle and its immediate aftermath, 6,000 Thebans die. The rest of the population, perhaps 30,000 people, are sold into slavery, families torn apart on the auction blocks, children crying for parents, ancient lineages scattered like dust on the wind. The city itself is razed systematically, buildings pulled down, walls demolished, streets erased. Only the temples are left standing, and the house where the poet Pindar once lived, spared because even in his fury Alexander respects culture and poetry. The complete destruction of Thebes, one of Greece's most ancient and noble cities, home to Epaminondas and the Sacred Band, sends a shockwave through the Greek world. No other city dares revolt. The lesson is learned. With Greece terrified into submission, Alexander turns his attention east. The great project his father began will now be his. The Persian Empire stretches from Egypt to India, from the Mediterranean to the frontiers of the known world, encompassing dozens of peoples and languages and cultures, ruled by the great king in his capitals at Susa and Persepolis and Babylon. The empire's wealth is legendary, its armies vast, its power apparently unshakable. Darius III sits on the throne, a monarch who commands resources that dwarf Macedonia's entire economy. On paper, the coming war is absurdly one-sided. The Persians should crush this minor northern kingdom as easily as a man crushes an ant. When the Thebans see the Macedonian army outside their walls, many refuse to believe it is actually Alexander, thinking it must be some other Macedonian force, because how could he possibly have arrived so fast? Alexander is more dangerous than his father, more willing to embrace absolute measures, less constrained by sentiment or tradition. Cross him, and you and your city will cease to exist. The Persian Empire is held together by force rather than love. Its subject peoples pay tribute and provide soldiers because they must, not because they feel loyalty to the great king. The empire is unwieldy, difficult to govern, prone to rebellions and satrapal independence. The Persian military has not evolved much in generations, still relying on tactics and formations that are centuries old. While Philip revolutionized warfare and Alexander has inherited those innovations. Most importantly, perhaps, the Persians underestimate their opponent. Alexander is young, new to power, ruling what they see as a minor kingdom on the fringes of their vast empire. In the spring of 334 before the Common Era, as flowers bloom across the meadows of Thrace and the snow melts in the mountain passes, Alexander leads his army to the Hellespont and crosses into Asia. The army is small by Persian standards, about 40,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry, enough to fit on a few hundred transport ships. Xerxes crossed the same waters in the opposite direction with forces ancient sources number in the hundreds of thousands, probably exaggerated, but still vastly larger than Alexander's expeditionary force. But Alexander is not attempting conquest through sheer mass. And yet there are weaknesses in the vast structure, cracks in the seemingly solid foundation. They expect to defeat him easily, to send him running back to Macedonia with a bloody nose, to make an example that will discourage future invasions. They do not yet understand what is coming for them. He makes his first stop at Troy, or at least at the city that claims to be the site of Troy, that legendary city besieged by Greeks generations before in pursuit of Helen. Alexander makes offerings at the temple of Athena, dedicating his armor and taking in return a shield said to have belonged to one of the heroes of old. Then he visits what is claimed to be the tomb of Achilles. Following ancient custom, he runs naked around the monument, his body gleaming with oil, garlanding the tomb with flowers, declaring himself fortunate to have such an ancestor, fortunate to have found a Homer to immortalize his deeds as the poet immortalized Achilles. His army is a precision instrument, every part carefully selected and trained, the companion cavalry for shock, the phalanx for holding, light infantry and archers and siege engineers, a combined arms force that can adapt to any tactical situation. The first test comes quickly. The Persian satraps of Asia Minor have gathered an army to meet the invasion, positioning themselves along the Granicus River. The river runs swift and cold with spring melt, its banks steep and muddy, the far side lined with Persian cavalry and infantry. Any army attempting to cross will be vulnerable, struggling up the slippery banks while defenders rain down missiles. Parmenion, Philip's old general and Alexander's second in command, counsels caution. They should wait for better conditions, scout for another crossing point, avoid attacking into such obvious disadvantages. The advice is sound and reasonable. Alexander rejects it instantly. Hephaestion places a wreath on the tomb, said to belong to Patroclus, signaling to anyone paying attention that he stands to Alexander as Patroclus stood to Achilles, companion and beloved. It is all highly symbolic, consciously theatrical, Alexander casting himself as the new Achilles leading Greeks against an Eastern empire, reenacting the Homeric epic, but with Persia as Troy. The Battle of the Granicus is chaos and violence distilled. Alexander leads the companion cavalry into the river, urging his horse forward into the rushing current, feeling the water rise and swirl around the animal's belly, clutching with his thighs as the horse struggles to keep footing on the rocky riverbed. The sky darkens with arrows and javelins arcing overhead. hissing down into the water with small, violent splashes. Men scream as they are hit, falling from horses or struggling to stay upright as missiles pierce armor and flesh. Alexander is the prime target, easily identified by his distinctive armor and the great white plume on his helmet. Delay shows weakness, shows fear, gives the enemy time to gather more forces. The army needs a victory, needs to see their young king lead them to triumph, needs to believe that this invasion will succeed. He will attack immediately across the river, up the terrible banks, into the teeth of Persian defenses. Reaching the far bank is like climbing into hell. The slope is steep and slick with mud, horses scrambling and sliding, men trying to maintain formation while Persian cavalry hammers at them from above. Alexander's horse surges up the bank, and suddenly they are in direct combat, swords swinging, spears thrusting, the confined space making everything brutal and immediate. A Persian noble, massive on his horse, swings an axe at Alexander's head. The blow would have killed him, split his skull like firewood, but Clytus the Black, one of Alexander's officers who has known him since childhood, drives his spear into the Persian an instant before the axe falls. The Persian topples. Alexander's horse is killed under him, spilling him to the mud. He painted himself as the new Achilles, and now he fights like it, apparently heedless of danger, driving forward while his companions struggle to keep pace. Once enough cavalry is across, once they have cleared space on the bank, the infantry follows. The phalanx deploys, sarissas lowering in unison, that terrible forest of spear points that no cavalry can break. The Persian line cracks and then collapses. The nobles flee, many cut down in the pursuit. The Greek mercenaries fighting for Persia try to surrender, throwing down their weapons, calling out that they are Greeks too. But Alexander views them as traitors who have fought against their own people for Persian gold, and he orders them slaughtered or enslaved. It is brutal and probably politically calculated, a message that Greeks should not serve barbarians against their own kind. His armor is pierced in a dozen places, dented and scarred, but he keeps fighting, finding another horse, rallying his men, pushing forward until gradually more and more Macedonians force their way up the bank, and the sheer weight of numbers begins to tell. The victory at the Granicus opens Asia Minor like a door swinging wide. City after city surrenders as Alexander's army approaches, or opens its gates after only token resistance. Some places welcome him as a liberator, particularly the Greek cities along the coast that have chafed under Persian rule for generations. 2,000 are killed, the rest enslaved. The victory is complete and devastating. Alexander has won his first battle as supreme commander and announced to Asia that he is as dangerous as everyone feared. One city provides a famous exception and a famous legend. At Gordium, inland in Phrygia, stands an ancient wagon tied to a pole with a knot so complex that no one has ever untied it. The knot is tight and weathered and impossibly intricate, a puzzle that has defeated the clever minds of generations. Legend declares that whoever unties the Gordian knot will rule Asia. Alexander examines the knot carefully, turning it in his hands, studying how the strands interweave. Different ancient sources give different versions of what happens next. Some say he discovers a pin holding the assembly together and removes it, allowing the knot to come apart. Others say he simply draws his sword and cuts through the tangle with one decisive blow. Alexander is careful to respect local customs, to maintain existing power structures where possible, presenting himself not as a foreign conqueror, but as the rightful leader freeing people from tyranny. It is propaganda, certainly, but effective propaganda, and resistance melts away like snow in spring sun. As summer fades toward autumn, Darius begins to take the threat seriously. This is not a border raid or minor incursion, but a full invasion led by a dangerous commander. The great king calls upon the vast resources of his empire, summoning troops from Egypt and Bactria, and everywhere in between, gathering a massive army to crush the Macedonian invasion personally. Either way, the symbolic message is the same. Where others see impossible obstacles, Alexander sees problems to be solved by unconventional means. He will not be bound by others' expectations or limitations. He makes his own rules. The restricted terrain actually works against Darius despite his having chosen it. His numerical advantage is negated by the narrow space. He cannot outflank the smaller Macedonian army, cannot bring his full force to bear at once. But the odds are still formidable. The Persian center is strong, packed with Greek mercenaries and Persian infantry, professional soldiers who know their business. He marches west with perhaps 100,000 men, though ancient numbers are always suspect, probably exaggerated but still representing overwhelming numerical superiority. The armies meet in early November of 333 before our Common Era at Issus, where a narrow coastal plain is pinched between mountains and sea. Alexander's plan is characteristically audacious to the point of madness. He will personally lead the companion cavalry directly at Darius, driving straight for the Persian king in the center of his army. If Darius can be killed or forced to flee, the entire Persian army will collapse regardless of what is happening elsewhere on the field. The flanks hold cavalry, ready to sweep around and envelop. And commanding from a great chariot in the midst of his army is Darius himself, the King of Kings, Lord of the greatest empire on earth, wearing golden armor that catches the late autumn sun, surrounded by his bodyguards, confident that sheer numbers will prevail. The battle begins with skirmishing as the armies maneuver, testing each other's strength and resolve. The Macedonian phalanx advances across the Panaris River, a stream that cuts through the plain, shields locked and sarissas leveled, their boots splashing through shallow water. They engage the Persian center, and the grinding push begins, men shoving and stabbing and dying in the crush, the front ranks of both armies becoming intermingled in the bloody work of close combat. On the Macedonian left, the situation quickly becomes desperate as Persian cavalry under the command of capable generals pushes hard, threatening to collapse the flank and roll up the entire army. But Alexander has already committed to his attack. On the right wing, he sees what he's been waiting for, a gap appearing in the Persian line as units shift to respond to local pressures and opportunities. Into this gap, Alexander drives with the companions, heavy cavalry in wedge formation, punching through the enemy front line like a spear through cloth into the vulnerable space beyond. Suddenly, they are thundering across the battlefield toward Darius, hooves pounding the dry ground, dust rising in clouds that obscure and choke. The Persian king can see them coming, this relatively small force bearing down on his position through the chaos of battle. It is a general using himself as bait, staking his own life on the success of a cavalry charge, gambling everything on one decisive moment. Parmenion sends urgent messages to Alexander calling for help, reporting that his wing is buckling under intense pressure. The collision, when it comes, is catastrophic. Men and horses tangle and fall in a screaming confusion of violence. Swords rise and fall. Spears drive through armor into flesh beneath. Alexander is in the middle of it, fighting with the desperation of a man who knows everything depends on the next few moments. His horse rears and strikes with iron hooves. His sword arm rises and falls in rhythm learned in 1,000 practice sessions. Around him, his companions fight with equal fury, protecting their king, driving forward. And through it all, across the last few dozen yards of blood-soaked ground, Alexander's eyes fix on Darius. Darius breaks, whether from cowardice or tactical calculation, whether preserving himself to fight another day or simply overwhelmed by fear, he turns his chariot and flees. His chariot driver whips the horses into a gallop, heading for the rear, and the sight of their king retreating is like poison spreading through the Persian army. Unit cohesion dissolves. Orders become meaningless. His bodyguards move to intercept the best cavalry Persia can field, noblemen who have trained for war since childhood, proud warriors who would die rather than flee. The two rulers face each other, close enough to see each other's faces. Young conqueror and established emperor, the fate of empires balanced between them. The Persian camp falls to the Macedonians, and within it they find wonders that stagger the imagination of men from a relatively poor northern kingdom. Gold worked into intricate designs, silver by the ton, cloth dyed with precious Tyrian purple, each yard worth a fortune, furniture inlaid with ivory and precious woods, works of art looted from Egypt and Babylon and cities whose names the Macedonians don't even know. The luxury is overwhelming, intoxicating, a glimpse of the wealth they are fighting to conquer. They also find Darius's family, his mother Sisygambes and his wife Statira and his daughters, left behind in his flight. Men who were holding their ground a moment ago look around and see others running and decide to run themselves. What was an organized fighting force becomes a mob of individuals fleeing for their lives. The Macedonians pursue with ruthless efficiency, cutting down the fleeing enemy until exhaustion or the onset of darkness finally ends the killing. Alexander's treatment of them surprises everyone and becomes the stuff of legend. He comes to their tent personally, bringing only Hephaestion with him. The two young men are of similar height, and Hephaestion is wearing finer clothing, and Sisygambes mistakes him for the king and prostrates herself before him. When a mistake is pointed out, she is mortified, but Alexander laughs gently and says there is no mistake. Hephaestion is also Alexander. He assures the women they will not be harmed, that they will continue to be treated according to their rank, that they will want for nothing. The women are terrified, expecting the rape and murder that normally follows when a royal family falls into enemy hands. The young Macedonian king has now defeated the Persian emperor in open battle and captured his family. The entire eastern Mediterranean lies open before him. He turns south, following the coast, securing ports to deny them to the Persian navy. Most cities submit without resistance, recognizing the futility of opposition. His behavior is so generous that Sisygambes reportedly comes to love him as she never loved her own son. And years later, when news of Alexander's death reaches her, she will refuse food and die of grief. It is Alexander at his best, combining military genius with genuine kindness, using mercy as skillfully as violence. Alexander orders the construction of a causeway, a bridge built out from the shore toward the island. It seems insane, an impossible project, but Alexander's engineers set to work. They drive pilings into the seafloor, creating a framework, and begin dumping rocks and earth and timber, slowly extending a path across the water. The Tyrians attack constantly, using their ships to bombard the construction, sending fire ships loaded with burning pitch to destroy the wooden structures. Workers labor under a constant rain of missiles, building defensive screens and fighting fires, advancing by feet and yards. The siege drags on for months, becoming a contest of wills. But Tyre, that ancient Phoenician city, confident in its island defenses and its powerful fleet, refuses. Tyre sits on an island about half a mile from the mainland, surrounded by water, protected by massive walls. The Tyrians have defeated sieges before, and they trust in their fleet to maintain supplies while any besieger starves and gives up. They underestimate who they are dealing with. Eventually, Alexander assembles a fleet from conquered cities, gaining naval superiority and protecting his causeway from Tyrian attacks. The mole reaches the island and siege engines are brought forward, massive towers and battering rams, pounding at walls that have stood for centuries. Sections of wall collapse in clouds of dust. The assault is launched through the breaches and the fighting becomes house to house, room to room, vicious close quarters combat where every corner might hide death. The Tyrians fight with desperate courage, but they are outnumbered and exhausted and gradually overwhelmed. When the battle ends, Tyre has fallen. The cost is devastating for the city. Tyre will not surrender and Alexander will not give up. Two stubborn forces locked in a struggle that one side must lose. After Tyre, the path to Egypt opens. Alexander continues south and most of Palestine and Syria submit peacefully, recognizing that resistance is futile. But Gaza, another fortress city, chooses to resist. The siege is shorter than Tyre, but still costly. The city eventually stormed, and its population sold into slavery. Another lesson in the price of defiance. 8,000 Tyrians are killed in the assault. Thousands more are sold into slavery. The island fortress that seemed impregnable has been conquered, and the causeway Alexander built remains to this day, silted in and expanded by centuries of erosion, permanently connecting Tyre to the mainland, physical testament to his determination and engineering skill. Egypt welcomes him with open arms. The Egyptians have no love for their Persian overlords who have ruled them with varying degrees of harshness for 2 centuries. Alexander, whether from genuine interest or astute political calculation, shows great respect for Egyptian culture and religion, making offerings at temples, honoring the gods, behaving as a pharaoh should rather than as a foreign conqueror. He makes the long, dangerous journey through the desert to consult the oracle of Ammonius at Siwa Oasis. What happens in the inner sanctum of the temple, what the priests say to him in the sacred darkness, this is never clearly recorded. The priests acknowledge him as son of Ammonius, but this is conventional language for pharaohs, symbolic rather than literal. Yet Alexander seems to take it more personally, and from this point forward, there is something different about him, a growing conviction of divine favor, a sense that normal rules and limitations do not apply. Whether he genuinely believes he is the Son of God or simply recognizes the political value of such a claim, the effect is the same. He founds a city on the Mediterranean coast, riding out personally to mark where the walls should go, where the major streets should run, pouring out grain to mark the grid pattern when no chalk is available. And then in late 332 before our Common Era, as autumn fades toward winter, Alexander enters Egypt. His ambition grows, expands, loses connection to normal human constraints. Egypt is pleasant, wealthy, peaceful, and Alexander spends the winter there resting his troops and gathering supplies. But Persia still waits to the east, still unconquered, and Darius has not given up. The Persian king has retreated to the heartland of his empire and is gathering a new army, larger than before, determined to crush the Macedonian invasion once and for all. He names it after himself, Alexandria, and it will become one of the great cities of the ancient world, home to the famous library and lighthouse, center of learning and culture, outliving his empire by centuries. It is the most successful of the many cities he will found, proof that empire is not just military conquest, but also the creation of lasting infrastructure. Darius chooses his ground carefully this time. Near the village of Gaugamela in northern Mesopotamia, on perfectly flat terrain ideal for cavalry and chariots, the Persian emperor assembles the largest army he can muster. Ancient sources give wildly varying numbers, some claiming 1 million troops, which is certainly exaggeration. More realistic estimates suggest perhaps 200,000 infantry and 40,000 cavalry. Against this, Alexander commands about 40,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry. Darius has scythe chariots, wheeled vehicles with blades attached to cut down infantry in swathes. He has elephants brought from the eastern provinces. As spring arrives, Alexander marches north out of Egypt, crosses back into Syria, and turns east, moving inland, crossing the Euphrates and then the Tigris, pushing deep into the heart of the Persian Empire, further from his supply base with every mile, committing himself irrevocably to conquest or death. The armies face each other across the plain in early October of 331 before our Common Era, as autumn advances and the air grows crisp. The night before the battle, Parmenion urges Alexander to attack at night, when darkness might compensate for their numerical disadvantage and sow confusion in the enormous Persian camp. Alexander refuses with words that echo down through history. He will not steal victory. He will win an open battle in daylight, proving definitively and forever that he is superior. Whether this is magnificent confidence or dangerous arrogance, it reveals something essential about Alexander's character. When dawn breaks, the armies can see each other clearly across the plain. The Persian forces so vast they seem to cover the earth to the horizon. The Macedonian army looking small and vulnerable by comparison. The Persian scythe chariots begin the battle, thundering forward across the level ground, wheels fitted with whirring blades designed to cut through infantry formations like scythes through wheat. The sight must be terrifying, hundreds of chariots bearing down at full gallop, the sound of hooves and wheels and creaking would growing louder, dust rising behind them. He levels and smooths the ground so his chariots can charge at maximum speed. Every advantage he can conceive, he prepares, determined not to fail again. He wants not just victory, but glory, not just success, but recognition, not just to win, but to be seen winning. Then the main forces engage. The Persian cavalry on the flanks pushes hard, trying to envelop the smaller Macedonian army, to get around the flanks and attack from behind. On the Macedonian left, under Parmenion's command, the situation becomes critical. The Persian cavalry breaks through and sweeps around toward the baggage train in the rear. But the Macedonian infantry has trained for this. As the chariots close, they open lanes in their formation, letting the chariots pass through harmlessly, then close ranks behind and pull the drivers from their vehicles or kill the horses with javelins. The fearsome chariot charge dissipates without decisive effect, a waste of Persian resources. Once again, he has identified where Darius commands in the Persian center, and once again, he is driving the companion cavalry directly toward the Persian king, seeking the decisive blow that will end the battle regardless of what happens elsewhere. The companions thunder across the battlefield, wedging through gaps in the Persian line, smashing aside resistance, always pressing forward toward that golden figure in the chariot. Alexander's page is killed beside him, struck down by a Persian noble's sword. Hephaestion is wounded, a spear slicing along his ribs, but he stays in the saddle and keeps fighting. And once again they are close, within striking distance, separated by only the width of a few horses, young conqueror and desperate emperor. Darius can see Alexander's face twisted in battle fury, can see the companions cutting through his bodyguards, can feel the whole structure of the battle pivoting on this single moment. And once again, Darius turns his chariot and flees, whipping his horses into a gallop, heading for the rear in safety, abandoning his army to its fate. The effect is even more catastrophic than at Issus. The entire Persian center collapses. Units that were holding their ground see their king fleeing and decide to flee themselves. Panic spreads like fire in dry grass. Parmenion sends urgent messages to Alexander calling for reinforcements, reporting that his wing is collapsing. But Alexander has already committed to his attack and refuses to be distracted. The dust is so thick that visibility drops to yards, men fighting and dying half-blind, guided by instinct and training. But Alexander presses on, always forward, his eyes fixed on Darius through the chaos. Darius flees east, deeper into his empire, hoping to reach the safety of the eastern provinces and raise another army. But his authority is shattered. The King of Kings has now fled from battle twice. What satraps and nobles will follow a king who runs? Meanwhile, Alexander turns toward Babylon, and the great city with its massive walls and hanging gardens opens its gates without a fight. The Persian satrap welcomes Alexander and turns over the treasury, filled with unimaginable wealth, enough gold to finance armies for years. Alexander enters in triumph, acknowledged as the new master of Mesopotamia. From Babylon, he moves to Susa, another Persian capital, which also surrenders peacefully. More treasure, more symbols of imperial power. Then on to Persepolis, the ceremonial capital, the heart of Persian identity, where the Shahs were crowned and the great festivals celebrated. The city submits, but what happens next remains controversial and troubling. The great palace complex at Persepolis, with its magnificent audience halls and reliefs showing tribute bearers from across the empire, is burned to the ground. Ancient sources disagree on whether this is deliberate policy or a drunken accident during a celebration. What was an organized battle becomes a massacre as the Macedonians pursue the fleeing Persians, cutting them down by the thousands until exhaustion or the coming of night ends the killing. He makes offerings to Marduk and other Babylonian gods, orders the restoration of temples, presents himself not as a conqueror, but as the rightful successor to the ancient line of Mesopotamian kings. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Alexander may have permitted or encouraged the burning, viewing it as symbolically appropriate, but later regretted it when sober. The destruction of Persepolis sends a powerful message to Greeks that vengeance has been achieved, but it also damages Alexander's image as the rightful successor to Persian power rather than merely a destroyer. Some say Alexander orders it burned as revenge for Xerxes' burning of Athens generations before, symbolic closure for the old Greek grievances. Others say it happens during a party, fueled by wine and the provocations of Thais, a courtesan who suggests burning the palace and is cheered on by drunk revelers. But the war is not over because Darius still lives, still technically holds the title of Great King. Alexander pursues him eastward through Media and beyond, chasing him through summer heat and mountain passes, the distance growing and growing as Darius flees further into the Asian interior. The Persian king's escort shrinks as satraps and nobles abandon him, calculating that their future lies with Alexander rather than with a king who has lost 3 battles. Finally, some of his remaining nobles, led by Bessus, the satrap of Bactria, decide their king has become a liability rather than an asset. The burnt ruins of Persepolis will stand for centuries, blackened stone testament to one night's decision. Tourists in later ages wandering through the chart remains wondering what happened here. Alexander finds the Persian emperor dead or dying. Accounts differ. He reportedly covers the body with his own cloak, a gesture of respect from one monarch to another, and orders a royal funeral. Darius is buried with honors appropriate to his rank, and Alexander claims to be his legitimate successor, the rightful ruler of the Persian Empire by right of conquest and respect for proper order. They place Darius under arrest, intending to use him as a bargaining chip with Alexander, hoping to trade the king for favorable treatment. But as Alexander's cavalry closes in on their position, the conspirators panic. They stab Darius and leave him dying by the roadside, his blood soaking into the dust of the empire he once ruled. By 330 before our Common Era, Alexander controls the entire Persian Empire from the Mediterranean to the borders of India, from Egypt to Central Asia. He is 26 years old. Any reasonable person would consider the conquest complete, the mission accomplished beyond all expectation. It is time to consolidate power, organize the conquered territories into a functional empire, perhaps return to Macedonia to rule from there. But Alexander is not reasonable by conventional standards. His ambition has no natural stopping point. The empire extends east, and beyond its borders lie more lands, more peoples, more kingdoms rumored to be wealthy and strange. The conspirators, rather than being rewarded for delivering the old king, are hunted down as traitors and regicides. Bessus, who claims the title of Great King for himself, is eventually captured and executed in traditional Persian style for regicides, torn apart by bent trees released to spring upright, a death of excruciating agony. To his companions and generals, men now in their 30s and 40s who have been campaigning continuously for 8 years, this is deeply troubling. They have conquered the greatest empire on earth. They are wealthy beyond their dreams. They want to go home, marry, raise families, enjoy the fruits of their victories. The next years are spent in hard, grinding warfare in brutal terrain. The mountains of the Hindu Kush rise to impossible heights, snow-covered peaks where the air grows thin and cold burns exposed skin. The valleys are narrow and easily defended, perfect for ambushes. If his army can march further, why stop? What limit should constrain him? But Alexander is king, and the army follows where he leads. And he leads them east into the mountains and deserts of what is now Afghanistan and Central Asia, pursuing the fleeing remnants of resistance, chasing Bessus and other satraps who refuse to submit. It is during this period that Alexander's character begins to darken. The young king who showed such clemency to Darius's family is also capable of great brutality. Entire populations are massacred for resistance. Cities that hold out against sieges are razed and their inhabitants slaughtered or enslaved. The peoples are tough fighters, nomadic warriors who refuse to meet in set peace battles, but strike from ambush and retreat into wilderness, conducting guerrilla warfare that exhausts the invaders. There are no more great victories like Gaugamela, only small-scale skirmishes and sieges of remote fortresses, grinding work that wears down morale and tempers. He also begins more fully adopting Persian customs, wearing Persian royal dress on occasion, employing Persian administrators and ceremonial practices. He attempts to introduce proskynesis, the Persian custom of bowing or prostrating before the king. To Greeks and Macedonians, this is the behavior demanded before gods, not mortal men, and the veterans of his army are deeply uncomfortable with it. At places like Serapolis and other settlements along the Jaxartes River, the campaigns take on a pattern of extreme violence followed by attempts at conciliation, terror and mercy alternating in ways that are difficult to understand. Perhaps it is calculated, using fear as a weapon while offering generosity to those who submit. Perhaps it reflects a growing instability in Alexander's temperament. The drinking grows heavier. Macedonian culture has always involved wine. The symposium where men gather to drink diluted wine and converse. But now the drinking bouts become more frequent and more intense. The wine less diluted, the conversations more heated. It is during one such session that tragedy occurs. Clitus the Black, who saved Alexander's life at the Granicus, gets into a drunken argument with the king. The details are unclear from the ancient sources, but Clitus apparently criticizes Alexander for adopting Persian ways, for disparaging Philip's accomplishments, for demanding divine honors, for forgetting his Macedonian roots. Alexander, equally drunk, flies into a rage. The remorse is immediate and devastating. When the wine fog clears and Alexander realizes what he has done, that he has murdered the man who saved his life, his friend since childhood, he collapses in grief. He locks himself in his tent for 3 days, refusing food and water, calling out for Clitus, weeping, threatening to kill himself. His friends eventually coax him out, and court philosophers craft elaborate justifications, arguing that kings cannot commit murder because they embody justice, or that Clitus provoked the king unbearably, or that it was fated by the gods. But Alexander knows the truth. He killed his friend over words spoken in drunkenness, and no amount of philosophical sophistry can erase that fact. Another death, perhaps even more significant, comes when Callisthenes, Alexander's official historian and nephew of Aristotle, falls from favor. Callisthenes opposed the introduction of proskynesis, arguing that Alexander is mortal and should not demand divine honors. When a conspiracy among the royal pages is uncovered, a plot to kill Alexander in his sleep, Callisthenes is implicated, probably falsely. He is arrested and dies in custody, executed or killed by torture, or dead from disease in chains. The sources disagree. Aristotle never forgives Alexander for the death of his nephew. Resistance is strong enough that Alexander quietly drops the attempt, but damage has been done. The simple relationship between king and companions, the first among equals and his fellow warriors, is eroding into something more distant and hierarchical. He seizes a spear from a guard and before anyone can intervene, drives it through Clitus's chest, killing him instantly. It haunts him. These deaths reveal the darker side of Alexander's character that becomes more pronounced as the years pass and power grows more absolute. He is capable of great magnanimity, forgiving enemies and raising former foes to positions of trust. But he is also capable of sudden, terrible violence, especially when he feels his authority questioned or his honor impugned. By 327 before our Common Era, Alexander has subdued most of Central Asia through years of hard fighting, founding cities and leaving garrisons, attempting to hold territory that even the Persians never fully controlled. In Sogdiana, he marries Roxana, daughter of a local nobleman. The relationship between the king and his former teacher, already strained by distance and diverging paths, is destroyed completely. The balance between these tendencies grows more precarious as the strain of endless campaigning and absolute power takes its toll. And then, with Central Asia pacified after a fashion, Alexander turns his gaze further east. Beyond the mountains lies India, land of legend and wealth, home to kingdoms that command vast armies and war elephants, a place at the edge of the known world where strange peoples live according to customs Greeks can barely imagine. She is by all accounts beautiful, and Alexander genuinely seems to care for her, though the marriage is also political, binding him to the local aristocracy, legitimizing his rule through marriage alliance as well as conquest. Their wedding feast is celebrated in Sogdian style, blending traditions, another step in Alexander's vision of fusing East and West. The invasion of India begins in spring of 326 before our Common Era. Alexander crosses the Hindu Kush mountains and descends into the lush green valleys of the Indus system. Some kingdoms submit without resistance, recognizing the futility of opposing this army that has conquered Persia. Others prepare to fight. The Macedonian veterans must feel their hearts sink when they realize their king intends to march on, ever deeper into Asia, ever further from the homes they left nearly a decade ago. The Battle of the Hydaspes River is Alexander's last great set-piece battle, and in many ways his most impressive. Porus deploys his army on the far bank of the river, swollen with monsoon rains, elephants in the front line, daring Alexander to attempt a crossing. The Macedonian king engages in elaborate deception, moving his forces up and down the river for days, feinting at crossing points, keeping the enemy forces moving and exhausted. The most powerful is the kingdom ruled by Porus, whose name in the ancient sources is probably a title rather than a personal name, like Pharaoh or Caesar. He commands an army that includes 200 war elephants, massive creatures that terrify horses and can trample infantry, living tanks that have never been deployed against Macedonian forces before. The battle, when it comes, is fierce and desperate. The elephants are terrifying, trumpeting and charging, trampling through the phalanx, using their trunks to grab men and dash them to the ground or toss them through the air. Macedonian casualties are heavy, but gradually discipline and training prevail. The phalanx isolates the elephants, uses the long reach of sarissas to wound them from a distance, javelins and arrows finding vulnerable spots until the maddened creatures turn and stampede back through their own forces, crushing friend and foe indiscriminately. The companion cavalry strikes the flanks. Then in a torrential rainstorm, thunder drowning out the sound of his movements, Alexander takes a force upstream, crosses at an unexpected point under cover of darkness and storm, and approaches Porus's position from an angle the Indian king did not anticipate. When Alexander meets him after the battle, legend records a famous exchange. Alexander asks how Porus wishes to be treated. Porus, bloodied and defeated but still proud, replies, "Like a king." Alexander is so impressed by this answer, by the dignity and courage Porus has shown, that he not only returns his kingdom, but increases its size, making him an ally and satrap. Slowly, over hours of fighting in the monsoon rain, the Macedonian advantages of training and tactical flexibility overcome the Indian advantages of numbers and elephants. Porus, fighting from elephant back, is wounded multiple times but refuses to surrender until the battle is clearly lost. But the army is exhausted. They have been campaigning for 8 years, marching thousands of miles through deserts and mountains, fighting in dozens of major battles and hundreds of skirmishes. They are far from home, in strange lands, facing strange enemies. Many have wounds that have never fully healed. All are homesick when Alexander announces his intention to continue east, to reach the ocean that supposedly marks the edge of the world just a little further on. The army finally refuses. At the Hyphasis River, the troops will march no further. No amount of persuasion from Alexander can change their minds. It is Alexander at his best, combining victory in battle with magnanimity afterward, turning an enemy into a loyal supporter through respect and generosity. Alexander retreats to his tent and sulks for 3 days, hoping the army will change its mind, hoping his officers will find a way to restore enthusiasm for continuing. But the resistance is unanimous and unshakable. Even Hephaestion, his closest friend and most loyal companion, supports the decision to turn back. Finally, Alexander emerges from his tent and announces they will return. He offers speeches about glory and destiny, about going just a bit further, about being so close to the edge of the world. They refuse. He tries anger and threats. They refuse. He offers rewards and honors. They refuse. His officers, even his closest companions, support the troops. They have followed him to the ends of the earth, but they will go no further. The return journey is long and becomes brutal. Rather than simply retracing his route, Alexander decides to explore, to descend the Indus River system to the sea, and then march west along the coast, mapping the shore and founding cities. The river journey involves fighting numerous tribes along the banks who see the invasion as an opportunity for glory or plunder. At the city of Amali, Alexander is nearly killed when he is first over the wall during an assault, jumping down inside before enough troops can follow to protect him. He finds himself separated from his men, surrounded by enemies. He fights with desperate fury, but takes an arrow in the chest that penetrates his lung. He performs sacrifices and erects 12 massive altars to mark the furthest extent of his journey, monuments to his almost achievement. But he must feel the disappointment keenly. For the first time in his life, his will has been thwarted not by enemy action, but by his own men's refusal. The man who conquered the Persian Empire has been defeated by exhaustion and homesickness. They reach the sea, and Alexander's Admiral Nearchus takes part of the army on the fleet to explore the coast westward toward the Persian Gulf, while Alexander leads the main body through the Gedrosian Desert. It is one of the worst disasters of his entire career. The desert is merciless, waterless and barren, scorching by day and freezing by night. Men and animals die by the thousands. His guards break through the wall and rescue him, but the wound is severe and he loses massive amounts of blood. Rumors spread through the army that he has died, and his troops mourn, believing they will be stranded in India without their king. When he recovers enough to be carried out and show himself to the army, weak and pale but alive, the relief is overwhelming. When the remnants finally reached the heartland of the empire in 324 before our Common Era, Alexander finds that his long absence has caused problems. Satraps and officials, thinking he might be dead in India, have grown corrupt or independent, raising private armies, oppressing local populations, embezzling funds. Supply wagons bog down in sand and are abandoned. Flash floods, roaring down normally dry wadis, sweep away entire units during the brief violent rainstorms. By the time the army emerges into Persia proper, casualties are horrific, possibly exceeding all the battle losses of the entire campaign combined. The great army that conquered Persia and invaded India limps home as a shadow of itself. He also holds a mass wedding at Susa, an elaborate ceremony where he marries 90 of his companions and officers to Persian noblewomen of high rank, symbolically binding together the Macedonian and Persian aristocracies. Alexander himself marries Stateura, eldest daughter of Darius III, in addition to his existing wife Roxana. Alexander's response is characteristically swift and brutal. He orders mass executions of officials, some clearly guilty of corruption, others possibly innocent but killed to make examples. The purge is extensive and terrifying, sending a clear message that the king has returned and demands absolute loyalty and honesty. Tensions rise further when Alexander incorporates 30,000 young Persians into the army, trained in Macedonian tactics but wearing Persian dress. When these troops are presented for inspection, the Macedonian veterans feel insulted and replaced. A mutiny breaks out at Opis when Alexander tries to discharge some of the oldest veterans with generous bonuses. The troops angrily declare that if he loves Persians so much, he should campaign with them instead. Alexander's response is characteristic. He has the ringleaders arrested and executed on the spot, then dismisses the entire Macedonian army, announcing he will rely on Persians from now on since his own people have rejected him. It is a gamble, a test of wills. The symbolism is clear. He wants to create a genuine fusion of cultures, a new synthesis of East and West where Greek and Persian are not conqueror and conquered, but equal partners in empire. But many of his Macedonian followers are deeply uncomfortable with this vision, viewing the Persian marriages as forced, seeing it as a betrayal of their own culture and traditions. Through all these trials and tensions, Hephaestion remains at Alexander's side, his closest friend and most trusted companion, the one constant in a life of constant change. The ancient sources are careful in their language, speaking of friendship and companionship in the elevated terms reserved for heroes, but it seems clear that Hephaestion is the love of Alexander's life. When Hephaestion dies suddenly in late 324 before our Common Era at Ecbatana, possibly from fever or poison or simply the accumulated damage of years of campaigning, Alexander's grief is overwhelming and total. He throws himself on the body and lies there for a day, refusing to be moved. He orders elaborate funeral rites costing a fortune. The veterans break first, begging his forgiveness with tears, and Alexander relents, accepting them back. But the incident reveals how frayed the relationship has become between Alexander and the men who conquered the world with him. The loss seems to fundamentally unmoor Alexander. He has always been intense and driven, but now there's a quality of desperation of someone trying to outrun grief through constant activity. He throws himself into planning new campaigns with almost manic energy. He will conquer Arabia, exploring the Great Peninsula and its legendary wealth. He cuts his hair in mourning, following the ancient Greek custom. He has the physician who treated Hephaestion executed, perhaps unjustly, but grief needs an outlet. He demolishes the walls of a nearby city as an offering to Hephaestion's memory. He sends messengers to the oracle of Ammonius in Egypt asking that Hephaestion be declared a hero or demigod deserving cult worship. In early June of 323 before our Common Era, Alexander is in Babylon organizing his next campaigns. He attends a dinner party hosted by one of his companions and drinks heavily, as has become his custom, trying perhaps to drown grief in wine. Over the next several days, he develops a fever. At first it seems minor, nothing unusual in the hot Mesopotamian summer, but it grows worse. He continues working when he can, lying in bed, giving orders, making plans, meeting with officers. But the fever intensifies, climbing higher. He loses his ability to speak. His companions gather around his bed, filing past one by one as he lies silent, able only to gesture in recognition. He will circumnavigate Africa, following the route Phoenician sailors supposedly took centuries before. He will invade the western Mediterranean, conquering Carthage and Rome, that growing Italian city-state. There is no end to his ambition, no point at which he will say enough. This is sufficient. Time to rest. The cause is debated then and now and probably forever. Poison is suspected, whispered about in the palace corridors. Some point to Antipater, Alexander's regent in Macedonia, whose position was threatened, whose son Cassander Alexander publicly humiliated. Others suggest various conspiracies among generals or satraps who feared Alexander's plans or resented his policies. On the 10th or 11th of June, 32 years old, burning with fever, Alexander dies. When asked on his deathbed who should inherit the empire, he allegedly whispers to the strongest or possibly to the best, depending on how you translate the Greek. Whether he actually says this, or it is invented by later sources to foreshadow what follows, it proves prophetic. His empire does not survive him intact. Natural causes seem more likely to modern medical analysis, possibly typhoid fever or malaria, perhaps complicated by the old lung wound from India or by liver damage from years of heavy drinking. The truth is lost in time. What remains is the fact that Alexander dies without clear succession plans, leaving an empire spanning from Greece to India without a designated heir. Roxana is pregnant and will give birth to a son, Alexander IV, several months after his father's death. Alexander also has a half-brother, Philip Aridaeus, who is mentally disabled but of royal blood. The generals initially agree to